Hello, this is Todd Luck, and this is a video on Easter eggs and references in Tarzan Battle for Pellucidar. This is a new novel that came out in recent years, and it's filled with all kinds of references to other works by Edgar Rice Burroughs, and I just wanted to do kind of a reader's guide to kind of walk through and talk about those references and where they come from. Obviously, this is going to be useful if you've read the novel, but even if you hadn't and you don't mind spoilers for the novel, I'm going to be talking about a lot of really great lesser-known works by Edgar Rice Burroughs, and I'm also going to be talking about the hints at where they're taking Tarzan in the future, and also I'm going to be talking about some kind of crazy canonization. There's a lot of things in here that are now official canon, including an episode of a TV show. So we'll be talking about that. And also, there is a name that's dropped in here a couple times. And it's an Easter egg, but it fundamentally changes the Tarzan mythos. And we'll be talking about that at the end. I need a little bit of space to talk about that one. So there's going to be a lot of information in this video. And before we get started, I just want to say I am not going to be talking about stuff that is mentioned in this novel that it explains to the reader or it's obvious to the reader where it comes from, right? If there's an annotation telling you what novel that it comes from, we're not going to be covering that here. This is going to be things that a reader who hasn't read that particular novel wouldn't know what that reference meant. I'm going to be showing and referring to a lot of comic strip adaptions for the works I'm going to be referencing. And so that is off EdgarRiceBurroughs.com, which has a comic subscription for $22 a year. They do some really fantastic, faithful adaptions of just about every Burroughs work you can think of. However, all of the works that I'm about to talk about have been printed at some point, and so you can find them in novel form out there. So let's begin with Chapter 2, which talks about the country of Lutha and its ruler Premier Custer. And so this is from the novel The Mad King, which is about this guy named Barney Custer. He visits this country named Lutha, and he's mistaken for the king. He looks just like him, which is a bad thing because the king has been locked up, allegedly because he's crazy, but really, there are some bad people trying to get his throne, and so the king has actually escaped at this point, and so since people think Barney is the king, they're after Barney, and so Mr. Custer, after some ass whooping and some adventuring, does indeed become the rightful ruler of Lutha, and he goes from being king to a premier, according to this novel, but he's still in charge of Lutha. Next up is Undead Rokoff. So Burroughs rarely used the supernatural in his works, but in a previous Pellucidar novel, he establishes a race called the Gorbuses, and they appear to be kind of walking corpses, and from the way they talk, they pretty much have to be people from the surface world who did very bad things and then died, and this existence as a Gorbus is kind of their eternal punishment. And so Nicholas Rokoff's Gorbus talks at length about things that he did, and so he refers to killing people with a gun, he refers to tricking jealous husbands into trying to kill people in duels, which he does in Return of Tarzan, and he refers to kidnapping a baby and making his father chase him all across the world, and that is a reference to him kidnapping Tarzan's son in The Beast of Tarzan, which of course results in Nicholas Rokoff's untimely death. And so our heroes go to a place called Tyler Shipyard and Aeronautics, where the airship they're going to take to Pellucidar is being worked on. And so that is owned by a gentleman named Tyler Bowen. And Tyler Bowen is one of the protagonists of The Land That Time Forgot. And so eventually he does get out of the land that time forgot and comes back home and is now in charge of that business. His family worked on submarines and stuff, so apparently they're now in aeronautics as well, and apparently working on the odd airship or two. And while they're talking about the history of airships, there's this odd story that comes up about some random crazy guy named Perry who stole an airship, and that is a reference to pirate blood. So this is the story of a guy who's descended from pirates, but he doesn't quite know what to do with himself, so he becomes a police officer, and then he finds an old classmate named Bill Perry, who who is trying to steal an airship, and Perry's gone crazy, and he gets on the airship, and it takes off, gets out of control. And I don't want to spoil what happens next, but let's just say it's some crazy stuff. It's from an unfinished novel that Burroughs did. And just a point of clarification, in that long history of airships that they talk about, you're going to see an annotation that's going to refer to Joe R. Lansdale's story, Tarzan and the Land That Time Forgot. However, if you try to Google that, you're probably going to come up with this. And this is Tarzan in the Land That Time Forgot by Russ Manning, which I've done a review of. It is an excellent story, but it is not the same thing as Campbell's story. They are two separate stories. I'm sure Campbell's is quite good, but so is Russ Manning's, and he also did a sequel to it called Tarzan and the Pull of Time, and you can get both of those in this trade paperback from Dark Horse. And there are plans to add the Campbell Tarzan and the Land Forgot story to the official canon list, and also get it on the shop on EdgarRiceBurroughs.com. So in the Gridley Wave call to Tarzan's family, where he says goodbye on his way to Pellucidar, there are quite a few names dropped. One of them includes a new member of the Tarzan family, but we're going to save that to the end because that's a major, major thing. And another reference, though, is to the Waziri. And so the Waziri are an African tribe that Tarzan befriends in the second novel, Return of Tarzan. So at this point, Tarzan really hasn't found any place he really belongs. He doesn't quite fit in with European society. I mean, sure, he loves Jane, sure, he has friends in the West, but, you know, he just doesn't really identify with them. And this is the first time that Tarzan really feels like he belongs. He can really get down with the Waziri's culture and their values. And so he actually helps the Waziri after they're attacked by these Arab raiders. Their chief is killed, and he leads them to victory. And so the Waziri make Tarzan their new chief, and so basically they follow Tarzan wherever he lives, right? If he lives someplace, they're going to live on the same land with him, and some of them work for him when he goes out on an adventure. Oftentimes they'll come with him and help out. Oftentimes they'll save the day. These guys are the unsung heroes of the Tarzan mythos, and that is who the Waziri are. Also worth noting is a name that was conspicuously absent when they were naming Waziri in that scene, and that would be this gentleman right here, Mugambi. Mugambi was Tarzan's right-hand man in the early novels, but then he just stopped appearing. And there is a prevalent theory that Mugambi died when the Germans attacked Tarzan's estate in Tarzan the Untamed and killed a lot of Waziri. However, he's not mentioned in that novel. He just stops appearing, and Dark Horse didn't subscribe to that theory. They used him in the comics in the 90s. And so while we're at it, let's talk about some jokes that some of the characters made on Burroughs' tropes that he would use repeatedly in the novels. One was by the old man who said that Tarzan has experienced some improbable coincidences, and that was just kind of a common technique that Burroughs used. You know, I've already given the example of Mad King, where Barney Custer just happened to look like the king, right? That happened all the time. You know, the characters would just happen to meet each other or get in certain situations, but that is a very common trope in all of fiction. Another joke was by Jane herself, who said, make sure Tarzan doesn't get hit on the head, that never ends well. And that is a reference to Tarzan and the Jewels of Opar, where a knock to the head robs him of his memory. And the similar thing also happens in Tarzan and the Leopard Men. I guess it's nice that Jane has developed a sense of humor about these things over the years. So moving forward in the novel, there's this reference that Victory Harben makes, that her mother had this vision of this warrior queen named Victory, and that's where her name may have come from. And that's a reference to Beyond 30, or The Lost Continent. So that's a novel about this alternate timeline where World War II just raged out of control, and it got so bad the United States actually cut off all contact with Europe and Africa. No one knew what happened over there. And so this military crew, of course, gets stranded on the shores of Europe, and they discover that civilization's fallen, nature has reclaimed the cities, and mankind has returned to savagery. And among that, they find this woman named Victory, who's the rightful heir to the throne of England. and so the hero has adventures with Victory and plans to restore her to the throne. So there's a lot of references to non-Burroughs works that are canonized in the novel, but probably the most unusual is the reference to the Lost City, where Tarzan finds a statue of himself, and they claim that he was some god who was there 400 years ago. And so that is a reference to the Filmation Tarzan cartoon from the 1970s and the episode Tarzan and the City of Sorcery. This happened in the first season, and so you can actually get that on DVD. And so I don't want to spoil the episode, but I will say that it is an Egyptian-themed civilization, so that might be fun for them to play around with if they want to follow up on that. And that there is a scene in there where Tarzan is escaping a situation, and he does something remarkably similar to what Suzanne does in a scene in the novel, which I thought was pretty cool. There's also a few references in the novelette. One is to Victory meeting an Inspector Muldoon. And so this is actually not a reference to a Burroughs novel, but to a series of mystery puzzles that Burroughs wrote that appeared in a magazine. And so I don't know if Inspector Muldoon's mystery puzzles have been collected in any type of book, but they are presented in comic strip form on EdgarRiceBurroughs.com. And then in the Quantum Interlude that's hidden with the ads in the back, Victory Harben refers to almost having her head chopped off by this guy with a wolf head helmet who was the grandson of such and such. That is a reference to I Am a Barbarian, and this is a novel about a fictional barbarian from Britain called Britannica, and he is captured as a child and is the slave of Caligula. And so eventually Caligula dies at the end, of course. And according to this, he must go back home and take on his family's mantle and become, a chief of a barbarian tribe, which is kind of cool. And before we get to that last big Easter egg, I just want to point out a couple things I thought were cool. One is the term for the angel-like creature that attacks Victory Harben. She's even got a flaming sword, and they call her a seraphim. And so that is a very clever play on the religious term for an angel, seraphim. And I thought that was really well done. I love that name. Another cool thing is that Edgar Rice Burroughs comics have been playing around with the idea of the fantastic lost cities or other planets that characters go to being in other dimensions and being accessible through portals and all of this stuff, right? And so one of the cool things in this novel is that they're referred to as different angles, right? And that reminded me of a reference in this Malibu comic back from the 90s where Tarzan says that Edgar Rice Burroughs described those fantastic places as being another angle of existence. And I don't know if that's coincidence or not, but I just always loved that line from this comic. And there was a lot of things that were kind of tried out back in the 90s in the comics, including Jane being a badass, right? Another thing you saw tried out in the comics was the idea that Tarzan would eventually leave Africa. In modern times, he would be living other places in other countries. And that was what we saw in the Malibu comics, even though those adventures always ended up with him back in Africa by the end of the story. When Dark Horse got Tarzan, they actually set their comic books during the time frame of the original novels. However, they kept teasing that Tarzan would eventually decide to go to the Earth's core. And so that happened a couple different times. One, he got trapped in a tunnel and just decided to keep going until he reached the Earth's core. And then another time he thought Jane was dead, and so he just decided to relocate to the Earth's core. And so what they're hinting at in these novels is a variation of that idea, except instead of just abandoning his entire family to relocate to the Earth's core, Tarzan is relocating with his family, and eventually they'll live in the Earth's core together. And in the Quantum Interlude, it foreshadows the changes coming in Kenya, that colonialism will end and the British will give back the land to the natives. And so this was actually touched on in Tarzan and the Legion of Hate in Dark Horse comics back in the 90s, a really great plot line. But in this case, Tarzan is actually going to sign over his land to the Waziri in advance. And I'm not sure how to read the scene. It could be part of him leaving Africa, but I honestly, just reading the scene, I don't see any reason why the relationship between him and the Waziri would change just based on whose name is on the deed. I think he could still stay with them if he wanted to. All right, time for that final big Easter egg. And so it's a name that's only mentioned twice in passing, but it changes our understanding of the Tarzan family completely. And that name is Charlotte. So during the Gridley Wave call to his family, they list the members of the family present, and one of them is Charlotte. Now, at the end of the novel, we clarify who that is by Suzanne saying that it's Aunt Charlotte. And just in case you don't want to draw a family tree in your head, that would make Charlotte Tarzan's daughter. Now, to my knowledge, there's never been a mention of this in a Tarzan novel or Tarzan comic. So where in the world do we get Tarzan's daughter Charlotte from? So in 1915, an Edgar Rice Burroughs story called The Man-Eater was published, and that is a non-Tarzan jungle adventure starring a woman named Virginia who goes to the jungles of Africa to retrieve some documentation to prove her inheritance. However, there's some villains who are also after these documents, and there's a man-eating lion involved. It is really cool. I highly, highly recommend checking out the strip on EdgarRiceBurroughs.com. So in Burroughs' original story, it begins in the United States, and Virginia receives a visit from a Miss Clayton and Miss Clayton's daughter, Charlotte. And so Tarzan's real name is actually John Clayton. And so the assumption here is that this might have been Jane, and thus Charlotte would be Tarzan and Jane's daughter. So let's put this in context. The year before this, The Beast of Tarzan was published in 1914. This established that Tarzan has a baby son named Jack. Now, there is no daughter mentioned there. And then in 1915, the same year that Man-Eater came out, The Son of Tarzan was published. Now, this picks up several years later. Jack is a young child, and the novel follows him all the way to young adulthood, and there is no mention of him having a sister ever. After this, Burroughs would put out 20 Tarzan novels and several other books with Tarzan in them, and there would never be a mention of Tarzan having a daughter. So I think it's safe to assume Edgar Rice Burroughs probably didn't intend for Tarzan to have a daughter named Charlotte. However, if Burroughs was still around today and he saw the fan theory that Tarzan has a daughter named Charlotte and he liked it, most likely we would open up a Tarzan novel and Charlotte would be there and he would have had a daughter the entire time, right? So what's stumping me, though, is how in the world have we never heard of Charlotte? Is she some kind of refugee from an alternate timeline where Tarzan had a daughter? Was there some kind of spell that wiped out everyone's memory of Charlotte until World War II? Is she the chosen one that her family has had to keep her existence a secret to protect her from the forces of evil until her destined day to save us all? Perhaps they can deal with it in a novel. It could be Charlotte, daughter of Tarzan, that we never talk about. I'm kidding. I don't know if Charlotte will ever even appear again. It would surprise me that she existed. All right, and that's it for this very long list of references from Tarzan and the Battle for Pellucidar. Highly recommend the book. You can check out my review for that. And I am just starting with John Carter, Gods of Forgotten. It is a very thick book. It's going to take me a week or two to get through it, but I will have a review of that coming, and I will let you know if there's any kind of crazy canonizations in that. Half expect the Chicken Men of Mars to show up or something. You never know. But seriously, like and subscribe for more videos. And until next time, see ya.